Alex, welcome to the Frugal Spender podcast. How are you?
Brian, good man. Thank you for having me.
No worries. I was just saying, it looks very sunny in your background. Whereabouts are you at the moment?
Over in Brazil, man, in the south. So
Oh,
we've got summertime.
nice. I was just in the Caribbean. I got back 2 days ago. That's why I'm slightly more. I mean, you can't really tell by the lighting, but slightly more tan than usual. So I'm very
hmm
jealous of the weather down there closer to the equator because England at the moment it's about -2 in that sort of area. So
I'm actually not close to the equator though. I'm closer to Argentina. So it's just, I
okay,
mean, it's just that time of the year, right? So
yeah, yeah.
I grew up in Australia, so I'm used to this climate. I've never had a snowy or a cold Christmas.
Mm.
Actually, it's always been a warm summertime Christmas. So I'm used to this climate.
Well, similarly to you, I grew up in South Africa, so it's pretty much the
Okay.
same climate.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Completely lost
Okay.
my accent, but yeah, it wasn't until I was about 13 or 14 that I experienced the crap weather of the UK and the actual
hmm
cold Christmas time. But I guess Christmas is meant to be cold, isn't it? So
I just heard the South African accent when you said 13, 14.
people every now and again, if I'm around South Africans, even Australians or Kiwis, it kind of drips out a little bit because it's
hmm
similar-ish. So yeah, Alex, appreciate you coming on to the podcast. If for people who are listening, haven't heard of you or don't know kind of the work that you do, would you mind just giving a quick summary of kind of the work that you do and your brief background?
Yeah, sure. Most people probably, I would say, know me from the writing that I do. So I've written a couple million words on Bitcoin just for my own blog. I had quite a popular blog on Medium back in the day when I was writing there. I wrote for Zero Hedge, for Bitcoin Magazine, for all these different publications. And in 2021, I published a book called the UnCommunist Manifesto. That's the one behind me here, which was basically, I mean, you can probably tell by the name, it was a anti-communist sort of a book, and we took the concept of the book. Myself and Mark Moss was actually
Hmm.
the co-author there. We emulated the style and the format, but we presented an argument for liberty, freedom, responsibility, basically, and how that's a better framework for civilization than the stupidity of communism. So I did a bunch of that. And recently, I just published a new book called The Bushido of Bitcoin, which is a book about the culture, values, and virtues we need to instill in civilization if we're going to be rebuilding it in a way that is lasting and ascendant instead of the degeneracy that we have in the modern world. So that's sort of my writing side of things. But my history is actually more as an entrepreneur. So I built businesses all my life. Basically, I dropped out of university. I traded the stock market, made money, lost money, made money, lost money, all that sort of crap. I built a sales company. I was in hospitality for a bit. I owned a gym for a little while. I tried all sorts of things, and I've had like failures and successes. And I got into software about 8 or 9 years ago, maybe even 10. Now, what are we in 2025? Jesus. Yeah. So I got into software actually 10 years ago now.
Hmm.
So I built some payroll software. I built a recruitment app, which failed, but it was a great idea actually. It's just I was young, stupid, didn't know how to execute. And then I built Australia's first Bitcoin-only savings app. So there's a bunch of those floating around now, like in America, Swan, Relay, all that sort of. So Swan, River, Strike. In Europe, there's Relay. I think in UK, Coin Corner and stuff like that. So there's
Yep.
a lot of these, but we kind of pioneered the idea of using Bitcoin as a savings instrument and creating an app where you just like dollar cost averaged your way in.
Hmm.
And I exited that in 2021. And since, around that time, that's when I doubled down on the writing and all this other kind of thing. And these days, entrepreneurially speaking, I'm building a new kind of social directory, I'm calling it. It's like a travel app that uses your social graph to help you discover places to go, places to eat, to visit, people to connect with, events to
Like
find,
it.
and all this sort of stuff. So it's kind of like, imagine TripAdvisor with the power of Instagram. Kind of that's the idea.
Nice.
So anyway, multifaceted, done a lot of things, and yeah, we can drill into
Nice.
anything you want.
But a lot of the stuff that I see that you talk about, it reminds me a lot. I don't know how you feel about Jordan Peterson, but the way you approach things kind of reminds me of the way he seems to be his approaches to his writing and when he speaks. It's very much like here's almost like a almost biblical way of approaching things, which is what I really like. And in particularly your book, your most recent book, is linking virtue almost with money, and I think that's something that certainly in the zeitgeist of the UK nobody thinks about or talks about openly anyway. So I think that'd probably be a really good place to start. Is what is it about Bitcoin that certainly made you intertwine the thought process of like this virtue and this philosophical approach that you have with money and Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, your comment about Jordan Peterson, like, I mean, I was a huge fan of his before it was cool to be a Jordan Peterson fan, and I mean, I think he's gone off the rails a little bit. I don't really follow a lot of his work now, but everyone has their arc, and I think he was very important in opening the door towards the kind of thinking that is becoming more and more acceptable now, right? Like, because the Overton window, it swung really, really, really out of the way. It had swung, deeply into the left, and now the Overton window is shifting back the other way, which is, in my opinion, fantastic. But yeah, for me, I always had a problem with sort of unfair games. Let's start there. Is like if you want to play a game of any sort, economic, business, football, whatever, right? Cards, anything. You want to play with fair rules. You don't want to play with cheaters. Not only because the cheaters have an unfair advantage, but you also, if you're a person of integrity and if you're a person that values things like strength and honesty, justice, etc., you don't want to win by cheating. And what I saw in the world as I dug deeper and deeper, and like the first catalyst for me actually was I traded the stock market very heavily in 2007, 2008 as a university student. I put all my money on the stock market. I turned my $3,000 of scholarship money into 60 grand. I thought I was a genius. I had my little spreadsheet. I was like, I'm going to be fucking richer than Warren Buffett in the next 3 years. Billionaire, here I come. And then I got wiped and I lost everything within the matter of 3 months. In fact, my goal was to be a millionaire by the time I was 20. And by the time I was 20, I was $250,000 in debt.
Wow.
And that kind of sent me down the gold silver rabbit hole, right? Like I started learning about hard money and all of this kind of stuff. And I found out, like I basically discovered this concept of money printing, right? Like the idea of if you are a central bank, you can make the dumbest decisions possible. And this sort of applies to a government. So we can kind of like call the central bank and the government the state, right? You can make whatever idiotic decision you want to make, and then you can print the money and you can paper over the losses, right? Like an economy is a game in which people make decisions and they get rewarded with profit or gains for making good decisions, and they get punished for making poor decisions with losses. But if you can somehow make a profit even when you make a poor decision, and like if you can do that, it's almost like playing a game again where you, I don't know, get shot and then the other person dies, right? Like the game doesn't work. It starts to disintegrate, and the people who are also playing the game, they change their approach to, instead of playing a better game to win because they're better, they change their approach to become friends with the person who can't lose so that they can get their favor, right? And it starts to distort everything. So if you start to look at the economy as a macro game like that, you get this thing, what's called, they call it the Cantillon effect, which is the closer you are to the monetary spigot, the more of an unfair advantage you get. And the entire economic game becomes get close to the central bank, get close to the government, don't actually provide a service, try and figure out a way to leech. Yeah. Exactly. Just try to find a way to extract from the system. So as I dug further and further and further into this, I came to the realization that we need a form of money that cannot be printed and that nobody has the power to change the rules of, right? So we need something independent of rulers, essentially. Something that is transparent and fundamentally sets up a fair economic game. And the only thing on the planet that exists today is Bitcoin. And we can go into the reasons why for people who might be interested.
I think it'd be useful because I totally agree with everything you said then. For somebody who might go, have a concept of Bitcoin of being internet, magic internet money that they would think is the same as Trump meme coin that's just come out. If they equate those two things, which a lot of people certainly do, why isn't Trump meme coin exactly the same as Bitcoin, and why wouldn't we just use that instead of gold?
Yeah. So we start with that premise that we mentioned earlier. So we need a money that people can't fuck with and that is incorruptible so that we can play a fair economic game. So downstream of that, things start to naturally move towards excellence, functionality. You have a sound system and all that sort of thing. So why is Bitcoin different than every other shitcoin? So I wrote an article, and I'll send you the link so that people can check this out later for a fuller thing. But it's called "Why Bitcoin Not Shitcoin." I think it's both published on my Medium, and also I published it on Bitcoin Magazine. It was one of the articles that influenced Michael Saylor, actually.
Wow.
So in there, I talk about the multiple differences, and I kind of broke it up into three buckets: the economic difference, the philosophical difference, and the technological difference, right? So let's just start with technological, for example. In fact, let's take a step back. Let's talk about what money actually is, and that'll help frame the technological argument a little bit better. So money has many different definitions. People call it debt, people call it a promise, people call it a commodity, people call it all sorts of things. But essentially, money is like a ledger for the game, right? Like it's a way to measure not only the language of value, because we all value things subjectively. You might value the microphone that you have more than I do, and then depending on where the whole world values it at, the price is sort of the midpoint of all of this stuff, right? So money is this kind of like mechanism for us to measure all of our relative values, and money becomes the thing that is the most liquid in the marketplace that you can measure everything else against, right? And so people might be familiar with the idea of store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account, right? So money is the thing, is the object or the unit that most or that best acts as a store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account. What is a store of value? People have a lot of trouble with this concept. People look at store of value as how stable the price of something is, and that's true partly speaking, but the true or the more accurate definition of store of value is knowing what your proportion is in relation to the whole, right? So in other words, if you want something to act as a store of value, you should know that your proportion cannot be diluted, because if your proportion can be diluted out, you are not storing relative value, right? And if we look at Bitcoin, it is the only thing that has a guarantee of 21 million coins. And we'll talk in a minute why that guarantee exists. Medium of exchange is defined not by how many merchants accept it, although that is also an important metric. I shouldn't devalue that. But it is first and foremost defined as, can you as the holder of that medium of exchange transact it without permission from a third party? And as it stands, there's only really two things that you can do that with. One is cash, because I can just give you cash physically. But if you're on the other side of the world, it's very hard for me to mail you cash or mail you gold. So like a bearer instrument is fundamentally the best way to do a physical cash exchange. But Bitcoin brings the power of cash into the digital world by allowing me to send across the web. I can also send it in a text message. I can also send it in Morse code. I can also send it, actually on a letter, whatever. Like I can write the transaction out for you. I can send it in all of those ways as information, because Bitcoin is fundamentally information, without the permission of a third party. So which means it's a perfect medium exchange. And finally, as a unit of account, this sort of comes when money is more mature, right? When you can measure more and more things as money. So money kind of has like a maturation. It has to first really establish itself as a store of value before it can be a medium of exchange, because you need to exchange value. And then in time, when it becomes a more useful medium of exchange, it becomes a unit of account because more things are measured against it, right? So you kind of have to have this progression, but necessarily it must have the attributes or the qualities for all three from the beginning, which Bitcoin always has, because 21 million coins, which means you can technically measure anything against Bitcoin. So for example, when I get paid for an article, or if I get paid for a speaking gig or anything like that, I use it as my medium of exchange. I get paid in Bitcoin. I measure my time in relation to Bitcoin. And I'm just ahead of 99% of people on the planet who haven't started doing that part yet. So we've established, what money is. It's a language of value, and it's a mechanism to measure the economic game, which is the game that we're all playing in society. It requires these attributes. It requires being a medium of exchange, store of value, unit of account. Now, let's explain why Bitcoin performs these things better than everything else. So if we start with the technology, Bitcoin technologically shares attributes, technologically speaking, with all the other shitcoins. In terms of its kind of like technical architecture, somewhat, right? There's a block. Somewhat, exactly. There's a relationship between how the Bitcoin blockchain works and how other blockchains work. The issue, though, is a blockchain is basically like or the Bitcoin code, I should say, and any other decentralized network, which quote unquote, the only one that's decentralized is actually Bitcoin, but that's another discussion. That code is basically like a digital constitution, and it has to run on every single instance of the computers that are running that constitution, right? So the network is made up of a bunch of participants or a bunch of players running the same rules, running the same constitution, right? And what makes the network a network is that they are all abiding by the exact same rules. This is the kicker with Bitcoin. It is the only network in which a central authority does not exist to change the rules. Every single participant has the ability to change the rules. So it's very important to understand. I can change the rules of Bitcoin if I want. But as soon as I change the rules locally on my copy of Bitcoin, I fork myself off the network. I'm no longer on Bitcoin. I'm now on Bitcoin, Aleks Svetski's version. Now, I need to convince everybody else on the network to come and go to my network. But they're not going to trust me, because who the fuck am I? The whole point of Bitcoin is no authority, no ruler, just rules, right? And what was very, very, very unique about Bitcoin was, to do this, you needed the network to spread into the world without anybody giving a shit about it, viewing it as important, viewing it as valuable, or any of that sort of stuff. Bitcoin had to spread to the point where there was a critical mass, there was a large enough critical mass of people operating that same constitution, such that any number of new participants couldn't develop enough critical mass to change what everybody else was doing. Bitcoin achieved that in the first probably 6-7 years because it was absolutely fucking dismissed. This is what makes the whole Bitcoin phenomenon so interesting and powerful, is that the genesis story, along with the technical architecture, along with the economic incentive, these things mixed together had to happen in such a way that it was like a 0 to 1 moment, right? Like, it's not something that we can go and replicate again. There's no way that somebody can come today anonymously, release something, and have everybody in the world dismiss it for 5, 6, 7 years, have it gain economic traction, have it gain mining traction, so that way there's more and more people invested in the economic, what do you call it, like the economic integrity of Bitcoin. All of that has to happen while people think it's all a scam, it's all stupid, and all this sort of stuff, right? So everything now that's come after Bitcoin has been an attempt to either copy it or to say it's the next Bitcoin or whatever. And every single one of these other cryptos are basically run by someone or some foundation or some organization or some federation or something like that. Everything from Ethereum all the way through to everything else. I mean, there's this whole fiasco going on Twitter the other day about Vitalik saying, no, the Ethereum Foundation needs a better board at some stage. But right now, I'm the board and whatever I say goes. And that's how Ethereum is going to be run. Bitcoin doesn't have that. So
Yeah.
what people can't get their heads around is this idea that, okay, anybody can change Bitcoin, but as soon as the change happens locally and they fork themselves off the system. And the actual Bitcoin network itself, which is merely a consensus of this constitution, lives on and continues. And that's where the greatest critical mass lies. That's where all the economic mass lies. That's where all that sort of stuff lies. So you've got this system, this ingenious setup where the rules of Bitcoin stipulate that there's 21 million coins. And that rule cannot change because it is perfectly open to change, but the network itself is immune to that change because not everyone is going to change. It kind of like takes advantage of, if you try and get 5 people to agree on where to eat, it's difficult. Imagine trying to get 500 million people to agree on where to eat. Never going to happen. So Bitcoin uses the human psychology, the human condition in its favor to establish a set of rules that cannot be changed because there's no way to achieve the necessary consensus. And we can get into why, getting more mining power won't change the consensus. Bitcoin's got multiple layers of consensus with nodes and all this sort of stuff. But fundamentally, you've got this system now where you've got the basis for a store of value. That's the first step that we mentioned earlier. Money must have a foundational root and store of value, and the definition of store of value is knowing your proportion in relation to the whole. If I have 1 Bitcoin, I know I have 1/21 millionth of the network, irrespective of what anybody says or does. If I hold my keys, I have that much, and I know that I can never be diluted. So I have the store of value function. Bitcoin being a decentralized network as well, this uncensorable nature of it means that I can do what I want with my 1 Bitcoin whenever I want, and I can broadcast that as long as I have a way to signal it to the world. The internet is the best way to signal it at this point, so I can do that without anybody's permission. And if I so choose, I can measure my goods, services, lifestyle, and everything like that in Bitcoin. And that's kind of the part that we need to get to, which is going to take decades. Like when people first discovered gold, they didn't magically measure everything in gold. It took a while for that to happen. In the same way, Bitcoin's probably going to take 50 or 100 years before everybody measures all their goods and services in it. That's a emergent property. But to kind of sum up this sort of thinking process here is, the world needs better money. If you want to have a better economic game, you need a better money. And Bitcoin is the best money through a combination of factors of the kind of technology, the way the founder came, stayed anonymous, disappeared, so there's no head of the snake to cut off, the way the world adopted it, how it was initially dismissed and no one gave a shit and all this sort of stuff, and then it was copied, and then all of this sort of stuff happened, and Bitcoin ended up being the one thing that is pristine money, that is uncensorable, unchangeable, incorruptible, and exists today as the only thing that anybody with a real brain is going to put a large amount of capital behind. You're not going to see a country go and buy fucking Ethereum because then they are beholden to Vitalik. So it's not going to happen. Maybe they'll throw some at it to gamble on it, sure. But in terms of putting a stockpile of, a significant amount of capital somewhere, they're going to put that in Bitcoin because they know that's the only thing that neither them or their enemies can influence. And that really, really, really matters at scale. And that's the whole point of Bitcoin. Bitcoin's aiming to become the reserve money of the entire world. It has to have the robustness to remain neutral. So I'll just shut up there for a moment, but that's kind of like
that was awesome. I wanted you to keep going because the way you explained a lot of that, I haven't heard be kind of weaved together in that way. And the thing that stuck out at me there is actually something that I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, is the fact that people had to not give a shit about Bitcoin for a while. And I think that's actually a really interesting point. 2 questions. Why do you think people didn't take it seriously? Because I know that obviously, the pioneers, the people who really understood what Bitcoin was, did kind of go all in early, and those people are, extremely wealthy as a result of it currently. Why do you think people didn't care in the beginning and just think it was a load of nonsense? And B, do you think if it happened in any other time frame, would that have happened, or was the time frame of post 2008, the economic crisis that the world was suffering, was that the important reason for people not caring in the subsequent years, or would it have worked if it's began in the year 2000, or if I know you use the example of it starting now, probably it wouldn't work. But do you think that was the perfect time frame? It's almost like this sort of like immaculate conception,
Yeah.
biblical meaning behind it.
I honestly, I think there's something immaculate about it. There's something special about the timing because stuff like Bitcoin had been tried for almost 2 decades. Like Timothy May, the cypherpunks, Nick Szabo, Wade Dyer, and all these people like had tried to do something like Bitcoin for decades before that, and it never caught on. It never worked. There was always something missing, etc. And I think it's the thing is it's never one of these things, right? It was a mixture of the right recipe, the right timing, the right environment, luck, all of these things. I mean, Silk Road as well. Like that came about. The fact that Ross Ulbricht was born at the time he was born, that came up with the idea when he came up with the idea, all that sort of stuff, WikiLeaks, all this kind of thing, they were use cases that proved the fact that Bitcoin couldn't be shut down. Like Silk Road was shut down, but Bitcoin could not be. They couldn't do fucking shit with that. So like all of this stuff happened in just the right way that you can go and replicate Bitcoin's code base, but the one thing you can't do is step into a time machine, go back to 2008 and start again. And this is why, like, a lot of people that are smart developers, for example, they criticize Bitcoin. They're like, oh, well, this could be built better and this could be built better and all this sort of stuff. But, Bitcoin has elements of the technical side that are absolutely a disaster. Like a developer will look at this and say, what the fuck would someone build that? But by changing it, the network becomes backwards incompatible, which means you would fork it off. So Bitcoin kind of has all these like weird fixes for upgrades to keep it backwards compatible that to a normal developer look absolutely, absolutely insane that you would never do that. But if you do it, you would fork off and there's no way to get the rest of the world to follow you on that consensus. So like changing anything on Bitcoin is a nightmare. Like Taproot, for example, has been this upgrade that's been talked about for 10 years and just got approved. And that is a minor change. So it kind of shows Bitcoin's resilience there. And yes, I think 2008, a mixture of the global financial crisis, a mixture of people in general focusing on everything else that went wrong, but a few people also being radicalized by that. Like, I mean, I was radicalized at that time as well. That's when I became a gold silver bug. That kind of thing happened. Unfortunately for me, I sort of dismissed Bitcoin at the time. I was like, oh yeah, internet funny money, who cares? I'll stick with my gold and silver, my hard money, to my everlasting regret. But for those that kind of took a gamble on that and read between the lines, they benefited massively. And a good way to think about this is imagine. Here's a mental experiment. Imagine you could go back 5,000 years when people were still using chickens and glass beads and rocks to trade, right? And imagine you find this big shiny yellow rock on the ground and somehow you could see the future, like, holy shit, one day everybody's going to use this yellow rock. So you take that rock and you're like, can I buy a chicken? And the person looks at you like, yeah, give me some stones or some glass beads for the chicken. You're like, no. This yellow rock is more valuable than all of the glass beads I have. And they're like, okay, can I wear it? Well, no. Can I eat it? No. Can I drink it? No. Can I clean it? No. So it's like, what the fuck am I gonna use it for? So get out of here with your stupid yellow rock, right? But if you could somehow live for hundreds or thousands of years, you would have collected this yellow rock on the ground. And when the rest of the world finally caught up, because gold had superior properties than any other object for the use of money. Like gold wasn't useful as a weapon, gold wasn't useful as food, gold wasn't useful as anything else, but it had unique properties in the sense that it was an inert metal, which means it didn't react with anything. So as you found it, it stayed in the state that it was, and anywhere you found it, it was the exact same thing. It was rare in the sense that you couldn't you either found gold or you didn't. It was fungible, so all the gold was the same. And what happened was, independently, human beings from all around the world started to use it as the unit of measurement. It was a store of value, became a medium of exchange, and became the ultimate unit of account. Bitcoin's going through that same process where the people in the early days had the same thing. They're like, oh, can I pay in Bitcoin? And you'd be like, who? What's this? What do you mean, internet funny money? Like, get the fuck out of here. I'm not going to sell you my services or my product for some stupid internet funny money made up by some anonymous guy, right? But if you fast forward 20, 30, 50, 100 years, like the story of Satoshi will become myth, and it's already in many ways becoming myth. And the fact that Bitcoin will not have changed for multiple generations, this is very important to understand. Money is a social phenomenon. The fact that it has not changed for multiple decades and for multiple generations will mean that people will be born trusting it. There are kids born today that will never know of a world prior to Bitcoin. Like my kids, when they're born, when they grow up, they're going to grow up by the time they're 20, by the time they're capital allocators, like Bitcoin will be part of the DNA of the economy. Like they won't know over time. So they will inherently in their gut, in their body, trust it. And what does money require? It requires trust. And what can you trust more than a network of constitutions that can't be changed by anybody? Like you're going to trust that orders of magnitude more than some money that can be issued by a central banker and changed at the whim, or by some shitcoiner that produce their own money, Ethereum, Solana, I don't care what it is, that can change the supply. Like any one of them can change the supply. Any one of them can turn it off, shut it down, whatever. That doesn't mean people won't gamble and all of that sort of stuff, and that doesn't mean there's no money to be made there. Of course there is. All of that's going to happen. But at the end of the day, people are going to move the profits back to the most superior money that cannot be corrupted, changed, stolen, confiscated, inflated, or all that sort of stuff. And that's fundamentally Bitcoin. So yeah, all roads point to it. And I went off on a tangent, but to your first question, like people had to ignore this in the beginning. It was such a far-fetched idea. You know, the idea that some anonymous dude was going to create a money that was going to replace the US dollar and gold. No one's going to believe that. Fucking nobody's going to believe that. But here we are, almost, 15, 16 years in, and the president of the United States is talking about setting up a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Like,
It's crazy.
Fast forward another 15 years, where do you think we're going to be?
Yeah, that's what when you were talking about gold then, and how like somebody saw a shiny little yellow rock. You can compare that to Bitcoin, but it's got almost double-edged, isn't it? Like gold, you can it's easier to understand because it's pretty, and I can kind of make jewelry. But the process takes so much longer for people to accept it as something that we all agree is valuable. Whereas with the internet, actually, Bitcoin is spread almost like a virus in a way that to point like yes, people didn't understand it, but people are understanding it at such a rapid pace because of YouTube and people like Trump. And once somebody gets it, they get it, and they start spreading that. And a bit like the conversation we're having now. Like I used to think Bitcoin was scam money, it was dark web money, it was Silk Road money, up until 4 or 5 years ago when I actually started to put the time in. And then I'm like, oh, actually, this makes sense. And then it becomes a rabbit hole, and then I talk to people about it, and then I try and orange pill people in my own sort of way. But the curve to understand Bitcoin at the moment seems quite steep. It's quite a journey to get there. But it is also sped up. It's almost like a double-edged sword. There's a lot to learn, but you can learn it quickly. Whereas with gold, it's kind of a bit quicker to grasp, but took us such a long time. So with this kind of mainstream idea, you said then Donald Trump's talking about it. And obviously a lot of people that he's getting into his government understand and are pro-Bitcoin, which is great for America. But for countries like, me here in England, I can't even buy Bitcoin with the vast majority of banks. They will just block any crypto. They'll just put it all into one bucket. Bitcoin, doesn't matter where, it doesn't matter who you are. You've earned this money. You cannot buy this. So you have to, if you want to, like for myself in particular, if I want to buy Bitcoin, I have to change banks, which to me is bizarre in a world where we have somebody like Donald Trump who's, talking about actually storing it as a country. How do we speed up the process of it becoming more mainstream? Even though it definitely is, like you said, after 16 years, we're at this point. Other than shouting about it like we are here now, how is that process even sped up?
Yeah, let me just touch on the first thing that you said about like this double-edged sword about we live in the internet age, so things proliferate faster. I'm actually writing an article now about like how to fix the fertility crisis, and my one liner on that is make it cool again, make natalism cool. The internet has accelerated. So the internet, social media, and smartphones combined have accelerated trends. Bitcoin will do what gold did in 5,000 years in 50 years, basically. So if you can imagine, gold went from being worthless, a piece of metal that you found on the ground, to being what everything was measured in. Before there was the US dollar, like, there was the pound, and the pound was, I guess, related to silver, but related to silver and gold. Gold was fundamentally the thing that everything else via proxy was measured in. Bitcoin is going to become that thing, and it's probably going to become that in 50 to 100 years. That compression of time is absolutely fucking insane. If you can imagine every single stock, bond, real estate, the chair that I'm sitting on, the clothes that you're wearing, like the cars that we're driving, everything is going to be measured in Bitcoin. Like the magnitude of the value of a single Bitcoin is going to be something like buying half a city, right? Like half a city block in London in the next 50 years. Like, I'm talking buildings and like all of it. You buy the whole like city of London for one Bitcoin. Like that's how much the relative value will change when you're kind of thinking that everything on the planet is going to be measured in this thing. So it's like, it's both the biggest thing to happen. It's going to be the biggest wealth transfer in history, and it's going to happen fast. But the learning curve, as you said, is also going to be steep because it's not tangible. It is like something that is foreign to us. But I wrote an article, and I'll have to send you this one as well. It's called Three Generations Theory. And it relates to what I said earlier about my kids being born now and their kids going to be born. Is for you and I, because we're probably both, sort of like millennials or Gen X or whatever, we're the last generation born with one foot in the old world and one foot in the new world, which is why we can sort of both understand tangible money and the intangible Bitcoin stuff. The Gen Zs and the generations beyond, they're not going to have the same trouble. They're going to be digitally native, so they will natively understand Bitcoin. So they will come to understand it much quicker than we will because they're going to be born with it. And the ease of understanding and the ease of adoption will track with the tapering off of the volatility and the price of Bitcoin. When Bitcoin becomes super, super, super easy to understand, will be the day that the relative gain of buying Bitcoin will diminish, right? So if Bitcoin is very easy for everybody to understand, and it's normal, that will come at a time probably 20, 30, 40 years from now when the generations that are being born then take it for granted. And at that point, Bitcoin will have accelerated in adoption so much, the relative change will be gone. So now, while it's hard to understand, you have an opportunity to front run everybody else and get that gain. And that's the same case with everything, right? Those who put the time and effort, who put the 10,000 hours in to understand the internet early on, like Jeff Bezos, have Amazon now. So that is the same thing with everything in the world. You want to be an outlier if you want to get ahead of the game. Like, that's fundamental economic principles 101, right? So I just wanted to really touch on that because the learning curve is steep, but it's as steep, like the steeper it is, the more you're going to benefit from it. Like, it was hyper steep when Bitcoin first came out. Like, to get your head around it and to fucking trust putting your capital into this thing when it was like 2011, you either had to have something wrong with you, or you had to be a degenerate gambler, or you had to be a visionary of some sort. Like, which is why so few people. Yeah, exactly. Like, well, one of these things, like very, 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 like 0.00001% of the population. It's a little bit more normal now, but it is still fringe. So people who are willing to contend with that fringeness are going to get the benefit and the upside. So to your second point, I guess the question is, how do we influence places like the UK to adopt Bitcoin? Is that right?
Yeah, essentially, like, every conversation that I have with somebody who is aware of Bitcoin, they're just like it was, a few years ago in America and most of the world. It is scam money because even I, being in the personal finance space, get DMs almost on a daily basis with scammers trying to scam me via Bitcoin, trying to get me to log on to their fake exchange and put in a password and transfer Bitcoin. And you can see why people everyone knows somebody who has either been scammed. This is a lot of reason why people stay away from the stock market, which is obviously levels below, because they've always, they've got an uncle or a friend's friend that lost money in the stock market, and they're like, oh no, I'm not touching that, it's too risky. I feel like Bitcoin is just for those people that on steroids. So they're just going to say, well, I understand pounds and dollars and the currency wherever you live. I understand that. I understand that it's worth less in the future because they might not equate it to money printing and that's the reason why. But they go, yeah, I know it's going to be worth less in the future, but I understand it because the shop over there, I buy things with the thing I have, so I get it. To try and put another layer down is almost incomprehensible, and a lot of people just don't see the value. And I think for me, that's the biggest thing. They just don't see the problem. The problem isn't poignant enough for them to take any real action. But as soon as you understand, and for me, it came from understanding money, what money is, and all the things that you listed earlier, all the attributes that money has, and all the things money needs to be. Once you understand that, which I think is how most people kind of get orange pilled, I think, is understanding what money is, why our money is broken, and then how Bitcoin is potentially a solution. You and I would agree that it is the solution. But for some people, I think they need to be kind of like, oh, is it the US dollar? Is it oil? Is it gold? Maybe it's Bitcoin. I think you have to kind of understand what money is to start with. And for most people, they just work a 9 to 5. They get home, they're tired. They don't want to think about it. They just want to get paid at the end of the month, have a nice car, have a nice house, and go on a nice holiday. How do we convince those people, those average 9 to 5ers, who, if they all put a percentage of their wealth into Bitcoin and then slowly, gradually kind of accumulated more Bitcoin in the future, we'd all be better off as a society? How do we approach those people who aren't YouTubing?
Yeah, it's there's no easy answer, man. It's like you have to. People need to decide for themselves whether they want to be the first pioneer settlers, or if they just want to come later on after the place has been settled. People like that move to a new region are going to come, like the Mormons, for example, when they went to Utah, everything was worth nothing. Or the people who left Europe in the 1700s and came to colonize America. I think the New York, I think, was sold for like a couple of pellets of skin, right? Like fast forward 250 years, and I'm talking like not New York, like just one part, like the whole of New York, right? So it just sort of depends. Like you can view Bitcoin as digital territory, digital real estate. This is a good way to like conceptualize it. And when do you want to colonize it? If you are willing to stomach the ridicule and the risk, and you're willing to put the work in to understand what it is, you will start to colonize it earlier. If not, you can come later. It's not like Bitcoin's going to disappear. The whole point of this thing is it's going to be here for hundreds of years, possibly thousands of years. You will still benefit at some point, particularly if you're alive right now. Like the fact that Bitcoin is this phenomenon that is designed and built to last for multiple centuries or multiple millennia means that even if you buy Bitcoin when you're 80 and somehow can hand it off to your kids, they will still benefit because it will continue. Like it's going to take the world many, many years to sort of catch up, number one. And number two, as human productivity grows, when you have a fixed supply of money and the total quantum of human productivity is higher, meaning the total wealth is higher, each unit of that money has greater purchasing power. So holding Bitcoin is almost like having an ETF on human productivity. So long as human productivity keeps increasing, the population keeps increasing, and all this sort of stuff, if you can fast forward 2, 3, 4, 500 years, and we've got 20, 30 billion people in the world, the relative value of that amount of Bitcoin that you have is going to be way greater. So it doesn't matter. Everyone is going to benefit long term from it. The question simply comes down to at what point of the curve do you want to get involved? And often the answer of that, the answer to that question comes down to, unfortunately, the amount of pain that people can tolerate with respect to the status quo, right? Like most people, through through complacency, through laziness, through fear, through whatever, all of these sorts of things, will sit there and endure death by 1,000 cuts in the fiat system because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% inflation is not painful enough to compel them to find an alternative. So they'll hang around, and they might finally, when the regime is overturned and all this sort of stuff changes, and Lloyd's Bank has Bitcoin on their app in 10 years from now, then maybe they'll feel comfortable enough. But then the price that they'll pay for it is a lot higher than what you and I paid for it today, right? It's literally a fractal of 10 years ago. Like when I first got my first bit of Bitcoin, like there was no trustworthy exchanges. There was no fucking way I was going to buy on an exchange. So, and you know what? The funny thing is I bought with a paper bag with some cash in it, and I thought the guy was going to rob me afterwards. Like, I'm looking at him thinking, is this guy going to, and he was looking at me thinking I was going to rob him or something like that. It was like sketchy as hell.
That's how you bought Bitcoin in the beginning?
In the first time, yeah, I had no idea what the hell I was
Wow.
doing. And believe me, I got hacked. I lost Bitcoin. I sent it to addresses that weren't right and all this sort of stuff. So like we all go through these experiences, and that's the price of being the wild wild west, man. Like when California was first being founded, there was every single scam under the sun, and this is the wild wild west of money, and every single scam under the sun is going to happen. And the only thing that is at this point not a scam is you buy some Bitcoin, you self-custody it, and you hold it yourself. That's it. It's very narrow. Everything else around it is some scam, and they're all gradations of scams, right? Like Ethereum, for example, is a scam, but it's a more legitimate scam in the sense that they're the Ethereum organization, Vitalik, and all this sort of thing. They're trying to build something that they, in the naivete, think is valuable, but in the end will fail for many technical reasons, many social reasons, and all this sort of stuff. But it still has value because enough people believe that there is something there. But if you look at the chart of Ethereum against Bitcoin, Ethereum is dying in relation to Bitcoin. So the smart money will tell you, well, you know what? Better to hold your money in Bitcoin than sit here and put your economic energy into a promise of some, group of guys in a foundation. Because I can guarantee you, if Vitalik's on a plane tomorrow and that plane crashes, it's over for Ethereum.
Yeah,
it's fucking over. It's over. If one of the core devs on Bitcoin or some, CEO of Coinbase or something like that, plane crashes, Bitcoin will not skip a beat. It's going to continue. So it's very important for people to understand that and to kind of get it through their heads. And, look, unfortunately to bring it back to your original question, it's like, how do we get people to understand that it's going to be, everything that you're doing is one way, but ultimately it's like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, right? So people need to be willing to drink. And at what point are they thirsty enough, i.e. do they have the pain necessary to do something about it?
Yeah, there's that phrase, and I think I heard it from Michael Saylor. I don't know if he coined it, but the phrase, if you buy Bitcoin at the price that you deserve. And I think that sums that up really well. The people who are prepared to take the risk are going to get the highest reward in the future. And the people who, like you said, once it's on a banking app, and it inevitably will be quicker in America than the UK for sure. But as soon as it's kind of seems socially acceptable to have a Bitcoin wallet on your phone, next to Apple Pay and Google Pay,
Totally.
that's when people are going to be buying it. And like you said, it's going to be at a significantly higher cost. There's something else you said that I want to touch on, is this idea of self-custody. And I think that, for me, led me to the idea of sovereignty, something that I don't think I'd really ever thought about very much until I learned about Bitcoin, which is why I'm fascinated with you, kind of your writing and the way you think. Is you kind of bring in all these different ideas to Bitcoin. A lot of people kind of look at Bitcoin and go, oh yeah, great, I understand what Bitcoin is. Number goes up. In the future, I could be super wealthy. I could pass wealth down onto my children. Fantastic. But there's, to a lot of people who become, quote unquote, Bitcoiners or orange pilled, it kind of changes how you see the world. And I've certainly felt that myself. And this idea of sovereignty is something that kind of didn't come. I wouldn't say it came naturally or doesn't come naturally to a lot of British people, more so in America. This idea of the right to bear arms and freedom of speech, something that just isn't in the kind of lexicon or the zeitgeist of England at all, really. And I feel like Bitcoin has led me down that kind of like, oh, you know what? The idea of gold, even though I don't own any gold, I'd rather buy Bitcoin than gold. But I like the idea of having a physical thing, keeping it myself and storing it and, protecting it with, security. Whereas with Bitcoin, you can do that in a way that certainly seems very scary to somebody on, either by memorizing some words or keeping it on, a USB drive, essentially. What are your thoughts on whether people should self custody? Should everybody self custody? And what's the importance of having the ability to do that?
Yeah, good question. I think having the importance of having the ability to do that is the most important part, right? And this is like the I guess the beautiful thing about Bitcoin is you can hold Bitcoin to the degree of sovereignty that you're comfortable with, right? That's a good way to think about it. So you can certainly hold Bitcoin in a banking app, and you can get or even an ETF. There's a good example. An ETF. You have no access to that Bitcoin. You have no ability to send it wherever you want, all that sort of stuff, but you have exposure to the price. And that might be all you want. That might be all you're comfortable with because, the idea of storing the words and this and that and everything seems like completely foreign to you. On the flip side, you can be some, super private cypherpunk, blah, 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 all this kind of thing, totally on the fringe. And you can have basically what gives you control of your Bitcoin or what gives you ownership of an amount of Bitcoin is the key that you hold that unlocks what's called a UTXO set, which is basically a set of almost like Bitcoin units, right? Satoshis that you have the capacity to sign a transaction that will push those units to a new address, right? If you have the private key for that, you have ownership, and whoever has the private key that signs the transaction related to that UTXO set owns the Bitcoin. So basically, they say there's that saying, it's like possession is 9/10 of the law. In Bitcoin, possession is 10/10 of the law. Like possession of the key means you own the Bitcoin. I don't care what any legal.
It's gone. Lose it,
Exactly.
gone forever.
Exactly. So it's like it's the money of ultimate responsibility. In the new book, Bushido of Bitcoin, I have a whole section on responsibility, and I talk about how Bitcoin is it's not just freedom money, but it's responsibility money. Like you are free to do whatever you want with it, but you're also responsible for everything that happens to it. Simple as that. And if you can trade some of that responsibility for convenience, as I said earlier, like you can hold it in an ETF or you can hold it in a Coinbase account, right? So, which is better than an ETF, but it's it's on the scale, right? And you can pull that scale all the way to where you have maximum freedom and maximum responsibility. And you need to sort of know which part of the spectrum that you're on. So, my long answer to that basically is the fact that there's optionality is what's important. And depending on who you are, what stage of life you're at, how you live, all this sort of stuff, how much of a conspiracy theorist you are, how much, you think the government's going to come after you, whatever the case is, wherever you are on that spectrum, that should determine the degree to which you or the method of how you custody your Bitcoin, basically. For me, I'm a bit of a sovereignty maximalist. I don't trust the government and all this sort of stuff. Me personally, I don't like the idea of letting some third-party institution hold my money for me, and that's because I've been debanked in the past. I actually recently got debanked 6 months ago by TransferWise for absolutely no reason. I just got an email one day saying, we regret to inform you that we can no longer give you banking services, and we regret to inform you that we cannot tell you why. If you want the money back in your account, you have to appeal this decision.
Wow.
I was like, are you fucking serious?
Your own money.
No reason given. Exactly. And I had to beg them to get my money back out. It took me 2 weeks to get my money out. And they did it, funny enough, they did it 3 days before my rent was paid. And it was annoying because I keep a minimum amount of money in my bank account just to pay rent. So, I'll sell a bit of Bitcoin and then I'll pay the rent. And and it was just so frustrating because like it happened 3 days before I had to pay the rent, and all this sort of screwing around. I had to go and ask people to pay the rent for me, and then send them some Bitcoin, all this sort of stuff. I had to do this whole game, all because the money wasn't really mine; it was held by a third party. Now, this literally the same thing can happen with a Bitcoin account, like exchange, and it could happen. Um, not for like the exchange trying to screw you over, but many exchanges have been hacked, right? And the exchanges are like, oh shit, it wasn't our fault. We weren't trying to scam you or anything like that, but something happened, and all your Bitcoin's gone. So I have personally had a couple of occasions where something of that nature has happened to me, where I've either been debanked or I held my money or held my Bitcoin in a third party app or something like that, and I've lost stupid amounts of money, like and particularly, like, I mean, at the time it wasn't so bad, but you fast forward 8 years of
Nowadays.
Bitcoin, exactly, you look at it, you're like, oh god, I
Yeah.
want to throw up.
Yeah,
um
don't think about it.
and
But also,
so
there are people who are bad actors. I mean, if you look at FTX, how many people lost?
correct.
How much people lost money off the back of that? And this kind of adds to the fuel, unfortunately, of people's fear, uncertainty, doubt when it comes to Bitcoin, because they go, well, look at I can see all these. I can just Google Bitcoin scam, Bitcoin corrupt, Bitcoin, failure, anything. It'll give you a huge list of things, including FTX, that were so mainstream, and they go, it's just not, it's just not worth it. And for me, even recently, I think the first time I actually sort of put my Bitcoin into cold storage was probably about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and it was around the time, or maybe a bit longer, about the time when Binance, there's a lot of concern around, because I bought through Binance originally, whether they actually had the reserves to back the Bitcoin. And that made me, and then that kind of led me down a rabbit hole of people talking about it. I was like, oh shit, I need to take this off just in case. But even learning how to take your Bitcoin off an exchange and put it into cold storage, although in hindsight seems quite simple because I understand it now, but at the time was like, fucking hell, I've got to put this money, I've got to take this money that already feels like magic, even though I felt like I learned quite a lot about it, still feels like fake money, onto a device that I don't know if somebody else, who I know I've bought it from what seems to be a legitimate company, but maybe it's not. And I got to trust that when I plug this back into my laptop, it's going to say that I've got Bitcoin there. So even the learning curve there for me, and I knew more than the average person about Bitcoin at the time, was still quite steep. So I can totally see why people just go, not yet.
Yeah, it's yeah, man, this is it's not for the conservative and faint of heart, I must admit. Like, it's something that takes like my wife's always saying this to me. She's like, if you die, I'm screwed.
Yeah, my wife says the exact same thing.
Yeah. So she's like, you need to come up, like, you need to come up with a way for me to get access to that thing, or just buy me a goddamn house so that if you die,
Yeah,
then I'm okay. And I'm like, but
yeah.
it's yeah, man, it's tricky, but that's the price we pay. Like, I'm sure that, I mean, there's already services, like there's a great one called OnRamp, based out of America, which is founded by a couple of the guys from Unchained Capital originally, and
Is that Jeff
they
Booth's business? Is that
no,
Jeff
no, it's
Booth?
not, no, no, no. That's he runs Ego Death, which is a VC
Oh,
firm.
yes.
So yeah, OnRamp is it's basically a what do you call it? A service for uh, what's the word for, like, passing things down? Um,
Inheriting?
Inheritance. Yeah, it's an
Yeah.
inheritance service. So there's these services popping up, and they're creating unique ways for, like, particular person to be identified, and then someone to have a key, and them to hold a key,
Oh,
and all
wow.
this sort of stuff. So there's services popping up, and that's just the nature of the thing. It's like the demand is growing for the amount of people who want to hold Bitcoin, and the demand is growing on all stages of the spectrum. The demand for the psychopaths who want to, like, hold everything and have multi-signature and all this kind of, like, multi-jurisdictional stuff, through to the 50-year-old who's like, man, I'm not technical enough to screw around with a wallet and do that myself, but I would certainly be a customer of someone who has a proper inheritance thing that looks and feels like I'm used to, for my general inheritance planning. So there'll be a solution for all of these things, and that's the
Totally.
beauty of the marketplace and how this is going to work.
I think comparing it to the internet, to Bitcoin, to the internet, early days internet, I think is useful for a lot of people as well. But the additional layer of being able to own a bit of the internet, I think, is also a great way of, for me, when I explain what Bitcoin is to people, that's kind of, I feel like it clicks a little bit more for people, because you can go back on YouTube and watch, early news clips where people are talking about the internet and the way they spoke about it and how, like, oh, this seems ridiculous. What do you mean I
Yeah,
can
the
do stuff
email and
online?
stuff.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
just
yeah,
seems
yeah.
so, it's just crazy. This is never going to work. And you can do the same with early Bitcoin. Was quite funny. I watched one the other day when they're talking about how Bitcoin just reached $100. It was a documentary. I can't remember the name of it. And how everybody was like, oh, the bubble's going to burst. There's no way it's going to go to zero. And you think, God, if only you guys knew in 13 years' time if you just bought one. But I think the idea of thinking, imagine you could have owned a portion of the internet, even if it was 1/21 millionth or even less, a percentage of 1/21 millionth. How wealthy you would be now if you could own. Everybody uses the internet because people don't even understand what the internet is for a start.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
99.9% of people who use it don't understand the layer or the code behind it, if we can relate it to Bitcoin. But they're using it day to day. So do you find that a useful analogy for like where we are now? And if you do, what year would you say we're in as far as internet adoption?
It's a great analogy. The thing about Bitcoin is it's a little bit more high stakes though, because if you owned a piece of the internet, for example, and you got that wrong, you could go to the alternate network. I mean, maybe if it was like the way you own the Bitcoin was like, sorry, the way you own the internet was equity, so there was value in there, whatever. Like you got it wrong, but I always use the example of the opportunity cost of the mobile phone, for example, like or the smartphone. If you bought an iPhone and the iPhone ended up bombing, like, and the smartphones didn't become a thing, um, your downside is not that bad. You lost $1,000 on a phone, whatever. It's not the end of the world. But if you adopt Bitcoin and you put your money in it, like your wealth, your savings, and you're wrong, you're gonna lose everything, right? So like Bitcoin comes with a heavier
Yeah.
decision cost, basically, and the internet is important. Like if you go and bank your entire business, like Jeff Bezos, for example, did on Amazon, on the internet, and he was wrong. Like if the internet didn't work and maybe something else worked, like AOL, right, or Microsoft's internet superhighway, and he could have been wrong. He would have fucked up. But people, for example, choosing to make Amazon their homepage, and or maybe buying some stock of Amazon. Sure, there would have been some downside, but it wasn't everything, right? So like even like so the analogy is accurate insofar as you're
Technologically.
owning a piece of a network, but the weight of the Bitcoin decision is heavier because you are entrusting this concept or this idea with your wealth, and so that's why it takes people um, a lot longer to get comfortable with Bitcoin, which is also why, in my opinion, I think that Bitcoin will take multiple generations to be as widely adopted. It's going to take longer than the internet to be adopted because the internet is a socio-technological phenomenon. Bitcoin is a technological, socio-economic phenomenon. It's got the extra piece added to it. So it's a bigger deal.
So do you think then, quite a lot of pushback I get as far as Bitcoin is people think in terms of Bitcoin. What's it now? For me, it's 83. Last time I checked, £83,000, so $105,000. Most people go, hey, even if I had that much money, I'm not going to put that straight into Bitcoin.
Mhm, mhm.
And B, is it even worth having less than that? Because they're thinking in terms of Bitcoin. What would you say to somebody? Would you just say get 0.00001 of a Bitcoin and get started there, or do you feel like there's an amount that people need to stake to kind of get invested in it?
Yeah, I mean, if you could go back and collect gold, around 4,900 years ago, it was still worth it, right? Like, and the idea, like and this is why I built that first Amber application, the Bitcoin savings app, is the goal is just like start collecting. The idea of somebody having a full Bitcoin 100 years from now is going to be wild. Like I said earlier, like a whole Bitcoin will be enough to buy an entire island or a city block. Like there's 21 million of these things. There's the idea of someone having a full Bitcoin is preposterous in the longer term, like 100, 200 years from now. Entire dynasties will be fed off an entire Bitcoin. The beauty of Bitcoin is that, like, and this is an interesting way to think about it, is normal money, fiat money, is capped at the bottom. So, you've got, I think in the UK, what do you guys have? Like pence, which is like the cents. So it's like, and that's sort of like, you get 100 pence in a pound. Is that right? Like in the US, yeah. So it's 100 cents in a dollar, right? So it's capped on the downside. But the upside, we don't know how many pounds or dollars there are. It's like infinite, right? With Bitcoin, the top is capped. There's 21 million, but you can divide infinitely on the way down because it's digital money. So one Bitcoin fundamentally is divisible to 8 units. So there's 100 million Satoshis, which is the tiniest fraction of Bitcoin at the moment. There's 100 million Satoshis in a single Bitcoin. So, I mean, I still remember the day when Bitcoin was still like early, and you would send people 10,000 sats for nothing, right? It was like, oh, 10,000 sats, here you go. And the number sounds a lot. I mean, today 10,000 sats is $10, but back then it was like 30 cents. Like, who cares? It meant nothing. Go and get yourself 10,000 sats, 100,000 sats, a million sats. When your kids grow up, like a million sats will be enough probably to buy a house. So that relative upside still exists because we are so early. Like, stop thinking about this in terms of 2 years or 5 years or even 10 years. Think about this in decades. Don't think about it in months or years. And that's sort of the way to kind of understand it and approach it with a collector's mindset. Every time you have a little bit of extra money, pay your bills, do what you got to do, be responsible, etc. But put your savings into something that is going to appreciate in purchasing power over the long term. Simple as that. That's the only thing you need to do. And just keep collecting. No matter how much it is, just keep collecting. Put some aside, put some aside, put some aside. When Bitcoin's $1 million, doesn't matter. Put some aside. There will come a point potentially when the amount you're able to put aside relative to how much you have is going to be kind of meaningless, right? Like you might end up with a Bitcoin or 2 Bitcoin, for example, and in 10 years' time, you're adding barely 1,000 sats every time you can. So at that point, you're like, oh, fuck it, who cares? I'll just spend all of my money that I'm earning, and I don't need to because I'm not going to influence my savings to a great degree. And that's kind of where, the earlier you get into Bitcoin, the quicker you reach that level, right? Like, I'm still buying Bitcoin today, but I'm sure in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, like the amount, like if I was to if let's say I earn 100 grand a year and I like squeeze every penny and I'm able to save 30,000, the difference between me saving 30,000, adding it to Bitcoin, and that $30,000, the amount of Bitcoin that it adds to my whole stack is going to be meaningless. So I may as well just spend the other 30 grand and just live life, right? So that that will change at some point. But if you've got no Bitcoin at the moment, like the goal is to grow the stack, grow your stock, and with as much flow as you can until the stock to flow ratio is so high that it's meaningless. And that's like wealth 101. That it applies to everything. So my answer to people is, you're still extraordinarily early, and it might sound easy for me to say because I got into Bitcoin a decade ago or something like that. But man, I lost Bitcoin. I sold Bitcoin. I was stupid. I did every single fucking mistake that everyone can make, and every single person I know that holds some Bitcoin regrets everything they did in the early days because they're like, fucking hell, I would have had 10 times more Bitcoin than I do now. But we all do it, and the best approach here is to just collect the shit. Like 5-10 years from now, you'll be glad you started 5-10 years earlier.
I couldn't agree more. I hate, like you, hate keeping money in pounds. So I will buy, whatever asset I can, whether it's Bitcoin or stocks, whatever. I hate keeping money in the bank, and not for the reason that I've been debanked, but part of it is that I don't want my money just sitting there wasting away, as it would be. Alex, I really appreciate your time. There's one further question I want to ask you before we wrap up, and it's about your new book. It's called The Bushido of Bitcoin. Firstly, why the name Bushido? And secondly, are you able to just touch on like the concept of the book and how the virtues within the book, you kind of, I appreciate it's probably a big question to ask, but maybe the key ones,
Yeah.
how the virtues that you list kind of intertwine with Bitcoin.
Yeah, we should certainly do like a dedicated podcast on it
I
in the
agree.
future, maybe 6 months from now. But I'll give a quick sort of overview. So for me, having been around the Bitcoin space for a while, I became interested in another question, which is, all right, I'm taking it for granted at this point that Bitcoin's going to win. It's gained enough critical mass, enough traction. It's got enough economic and social weight now, enough economic and social gravity that it's going to keep sucking money and interest in, right? So Bitcoin's going to win. The question that I'm interested in, okay, so the people who have all the Bitcoin, who have a lot of the Bitcoin, who do they become? Do they become another, parasitic political class? Do they become a bunch of degenerates with Lambos? Or do they become men and women of virtue? Like, do they look to construct a better civilization? And if it is the latter, what sort of virtues must they embody and inculcate in order to build a better civilization? So that's sort of the question that I'm interested in. So what I did was I went back and looked at the great civilizations throughout history, feudal Japan, Christian Europe, Romans, the Greeks, all these sort of cultures, all these sort of civilizations. And I looked at what were the cultures that preceded them. And more importantly then, because what's upstream of culture is behavior and principles of the individuals. What were the behaviors and principles, which if you kind of combine the words behavior and principle, it just means virtue, basically. What were the virtues that they embodied, inculcated, lived by, that created those cultures, that created those civilizations? Because that's where, like, the book isn't, Svetsky's 10 Commandments. It's like, what were the virtues that were
Makes
that
a
came up.
successful
Oh, yeah,
civilization.
exactly. That came up over and over and over again, irrespective of time, of age, of geography. And I found that there was a massive overlap. Like, the word Bushido means way of the warrior, and it means like a code of ethics or a code of virtue that people live by. And it was very similar to chivalry in the West. And what's funny is that they both emerged around the same time, and they were both basically identical, and one was in Japan, one was in Europe. They had no interrelation amongst each other. So all this sort of stuff was very interesting to me. So the book kind of explores, okay, those who have the wealth, who do they become? How do they behave? And what kind of virtues must they inculcate? So I go through all of that, then I ask a bunch of tough questions around like wealth, governance, culture, like even down to things like, does wealth corrupt? Like, is it inevitable that as we become wealthy as a culture, as a civilization, that we kind of cut off our own feet by becoming excessively comfortable, safety oriented, and liberal? And can Bitcoin somehow short circuit that? So there's a bunch of questions in there that I ask, and I sort of like, it's a book where I wrestle with myself and wrestle with these concepts and all of that, and then I dig into a practice, like these are the virtues, this is what we want to establish, this is the impact that it's going to have on the world, and this is how Bitcoin's going to affect it. How do we practice these virtues? How do we build these up? How do we inculcate them in society? So there's a whole section on praxis. And then the end of the book is called Visions of the Future, where it started off as me writing about like future governance models, how the world is going to look and run and all this sort of stuff. And then my editor was like, dude, you just spent 500 pages writing abstract theories. Like, tell me a story. So instead, I kind of like fast forward to 2084, and I paint this picture of a world of like how the world's bifurcated into like this globalist element, which is running on CBDCs and surveillance and all this sort of shit, versus this network of, I call, executive states, which are smaller city states that are run on Bitcoin, and basically look like a somewhat of a monarchy slash corporate entity. So I kind of call the leaders of the executive state CEO kings. You can kind of like imagine a Dubai or a El Salvador, what Bukele's building there, and all this sort of stuff, and I explain like basically I tell a story that juxtaposes these two visions of the future against each other, and it's quite interesting. I've had a lot of good feedback on that. It was my first time trying to write fiction, so that's basically the premise of the book, and I try and relate each of these virtues to Bitcoin in some way, shape, or form. So the end of each virtue chapter ties it to Bitcoin. So that's for me the next big question. That's the new frontier, because I'm convinced at this point that Bitcoin's going to win. That's not the problem. And there's going to be many battles for Bitcoin to fight. Custody and all this. There's all this madness going on in Europe and everything like that. But on a long enough time frame, Bitcoin wins. What I'm, as I said, more interested in now is like, who do we become when it wins, and how do we make the plant the seeds for a stronger culture, and how do we use Bitcoin in that? Like, if I had to sum it up, it's a book about combining capital and character. Bitcoin takes care of the capital piece. Let's add the character piece, because you want to be on the upper right-hand quadrant. If you kind of imagine, capital and character, like you want to have capital and character. If you have to pick between the two, if you have to be without one, be without capital, have character and no capital, because to have capital and have no character, you're sort of like Bill Gates, for example, which you don't want to be. And then you certainly don't want to be no capital and no character. It's like a bum and a criminal, right? So you want to be in the top right-hand quadrant. And, my whole argument is, all right, Bitcoiners, leaders of the future, how must we behave? Who must we become? So it's a if you like history, philosophy, and sort of like the big questions, metaphysics, and all this kind of stuff. It's a tour de force. It'll challenge people in the way they think.
Yeah, totally. I'm a couple of hundred pages into your book now, and I love your writing style. And I think every kind of technology or innovation needs people like you who are thinking that next step. I totally appreciate the work that you're doing and thinking you're convinced Bitcoin's succeeding and it's just a matter of time. And I really like that you're looking that next step. And I'd love to have you back on in the future to discuss that more, because I appreciate I asked you a question that would be multiple hour long episodes. So I'd love to have you back in the future. Honestly, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Everything that you've distilled there as far as Bitcoin, I've actually learned a ton, even though I've watched a lot of your videos, I've read a lot of your stuff, and I've still learnt from you today. So I totally appreciate you taking the time today, Alex.
Absolutely.
Where can people, other than the book, and I'll leave links to all of your books in the description of the video and also the podcast, but where would you direct people to go and learn more about your writings?
I mean, if people go to, I'll throw out 3 links. So Svetski.info. So my name is spelled Svetski. .info. There's I think that should go to my link tree, and then there's links to everything there. My Twitter is a great place. So my handle is Svetski Writes, SvetskiRites, and it's the same handle for Instagram. Or alternatively, just go to my go to Bushido of Bitcoin.com, and then that's an easy way to find all the links, because I write semi-regularly now on Substack. I'm actually, as I said earlier, I'm writing an essay now on the fertility crisis and how to fix that, and I'm writing about sort of freedom and governance and everything like that at the moment. There's a series of mini essays that I'm going to release. But that's sort of the places I would suggest, and I recommend everyone go and watch the trailer I made for the book. I promise it'll blow you away. It's a wild trailer.
I'll leave the link to that as well. Alex,
Excellent.
appreciate you, mate. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.